The Vietnam War is like it's always playing on TV, and he can choose to watch it or not watch it, but it's always on. And that's a heavy price to pay for somebody who was 19 years old and made a decision to serve their country.
The wife of a Vietnam War veteran shares with us how she cares, loves, and works to understand her warrior husband.
There's more to that story that I couldn't write about. It's been over 55 years, and that day, that particular day, among many others, is still clear.
And though he lives with a loving partner, he still lives alongside the memories of Vietnam combat. Hello and welcome to the Mighty Pen Podcast. I'm David L. Robbins, your host and founder of the Mighty Pen Project, a free writing program for veterans and their families, in partnership with the Virginia War Memorial Foundation here in Richmond, Virginia. In this podcast, I'll sit down with Pat and Sheri Clark, a longtime married couple. Pat served in the U.S. Army in Vietnam. Sheri is his compassionate wife. The three of us will have a deep and insightful conversation about survival and love during and after war. Both Pat and Sheri became accomplished writers in the Mighty Pen Project. We'll hear 4 short pieces written by them. First up, Greater Love, read by Dean Knight.
Lumbering through the berm and past the checkpoint, the deuce and a half turned left and headed down a rough, barely paved road. Bouncing and swerving north for a time, the convoy then turned west on another equally rough Delta road. The division base camp was located near a small city along a branch of the Mekong River. The 4 dusty, olive-drab trucks were headed a few kilometers into the bush to return the men to their fire base. The road had been swept from mines earlier that day, but ambushes were always a possibility. 2 men stood as lookouts in the front corners behind the cab, and 2 sat in the back facing the rear. Everyone else just rode along talking or smoking or looking at the scenery, but always on alert. Although the men appeared relaxed, each knew that his life depended on the others. They were riding through small clusters of hooches that seemed to be what passed for the suburbs in this part of Vietnam. Farther along, the road ran between green jungle and wide-open rice paddies being tended by farmers and their ever-present water buffalo. Always aware of the danger, they kept a wary eye on both sides of the road. Some of them groused about the kidney-jarring ride, the smells, and why the brass couldn't have flown them out on choppers. Flying was faster and safer, after all. So far, it was a routine trip without any sniper fire. Over the rumble of a truck came a sharp metallic clang. One of the men sitting toward the front jumped up and, like a defensive lineman scrambling for a fumble, fell on the grenade that was bouncing on the bed of the truck. Frozen, the men waited for the inevitable detonation, but none came. In what seemed like an eternity, the man grabbed the grenade and threw it into the nearby paddy. Still no detonation. Was it a dud? Where had it come from? How could a VC have gotten so close without being noticed? As the men began to realize they were safe, someone noticed that one of the grenades he had clipped to his web gear was missing. At least most of it was missing. The fuse, the safety pin, and the lever were still there. It seems while bouncing along the road, the body of the grenade had loosened, come unscrewed, and fallen to the floor. No one spoke for a time as they looked at each other. Soon the convoy reached the fire base and the men jumped from the truck. Someone mentioned to the lieutenant the possibility of putting their buddy in for a medal, maybe a Bronze Star or even a Silver Star. But nothing was ever done because the grenade didn't detonate.
Now, Collateral Damage, also by Pat Clark, read again by Dean Knight. Following that, I'll talk with Pat and Sheri.
Despite the damp and rotting vegetation of the Delta jungle, the smell of the firefight hung in the air. The trauma and chaos of battle were over. Searching and destroying were history. Mopping up was all that remained. The village from which the ambush had come lay across a canal, tucked neatly into the edge of a tree line abutting a dry rice paddy. Deep green shade covered thatched hooches. An open area of hard-packed dirt in the center of the village was bathed in dappled sunlight. Perhaps not idyllic, but appealing, at least until the ambush. And now it was time to care for the wounded and secure the village. 3 squads would check for VC and hidden weapons, while 1 squad secured an LZ in the paddy for the dust-off chopper. Open-sided hooches were the easiest to search, with the exception of the mounded, dried mud bunkers. Sometimes, after taking heavy casualties, these hiding places were checked with grenades, but not today. Other hooches with more substantial walls might provide some protection and privacy for occupants, but they were also cover for Charlie. They required more care. No obvious VC were found among the children and elderly. Some of the villagers had visible wounds, and some were only traumatized by the fighting. Those who could walk were herded into the center clearing and guarded. The badly wounded stay where they fell, cut down perhaps by VC with their AK-47s, or, more likely, by Americans with their M16s, M60s, and M79s. An Army medic, using only GI cotton bandages, was desperately trying to undo what bullets and shrapnel had done. The platoon seemed pleased with its action during the firefight and afterward. Searches revealed some evidence of blood trails leading into the jungle. However, no weapons or enemy were found dead. But this area was a VC stronghold, and even this spurious victory was deemed worthy of celebration, perhaps if only for the relief of surviving. The euphoria following a firefight seems to dull the part of the brain that feels guilt or remorse. Focus on survival means little else can clutter thoughts. The problem is, like a narcotic, it dulls, but does not erase. Images seem to be etched permanently. For those who've experienced war, time has perhaps altered recollections and allowed the mind to soften the harshness of reality. But for some, memories linger, explicit and frighteningly real. Especially at night. Apparently, there is no expiration date for the anguish of collateral damage.
And I'm joined in the studio by the author of those 2 stories, Pat Clark, and his wife, Sheri Clark, both graduates of the Mighty Pen. Pat, a veteran of Vietnam, Sheri, his wife, and herself a magnificent writer, as we will hear in the 2 stories upcoming. But for now, let's talk to them both. Thanks for coming, obviously. Guys, I remember the first night we met. Pat, you came in and sat at the table, and Sheri, you sat against the wall. And I said, wait, what are you doing? And he said, well, yeah, he's the veteran. I go, no. Come and sit with us. And you were the Mighty Pen Project's, Sheri, our first spouse. And I learned then and there, teaching you and having you in that class and having you sit next to Pat. And I've learned it several times over since, but you taught me how much spouses serve. And so, Pat, these are your stories, but I'd like to start with Sheri. How important it is that these men and women in uniform have the people that are waiting for them and the people that care for them and love them and support them, because they have collateral damage. They've experienced these things, and to have the folks like you, Sheri, just there for them. It's beautiful to see and powerful. And I'm committed to having more spouse voices on these podcasts. But you remember that first night?
I do. He wouldn't have come if I didn't come. So that's why I had contacted you about coming myself, because I knew he would never come on his own.
Well, why?
He's an introvert, and he doesn't talk about his service.
Well, Pat, first let's talk about greater love. If that grenade hits the floor of that truck, when you first saw it, do you think that every man in that truck, what was their first thought?
I think that we're dead.
You're right, he doesn't talk about it.
That's...
Yeah. the young soldier that jumped on it. I mean, obviously you can only guess what was in his head.
I don't know. I think it was instinctive, and he just jumped, fell, whatever. But he did, if like me, you grew up in the 50s and you saw World War II movies, he did what the hero always does. He sacrificed himself for others.
He wasn't the only hero in that truck, though. Others may have had the same reaction.
Perhaps.
Yeah. How relieved were you?
I don't know that relief is the word. That came later. There is too much adrenaline to really think clearly about what's just happened.
A thread through those two stories, Greater Love and Collateral Damage, is that in the end, they're about survival. First one, you survived what could have been a tragic accident. And the second one, you survived a firefight. In both instances, you describe, I guess the only way I can say it is not dying in combat. Yet in Collateral Damage, you're more specific than you are in Greater Love. You go into the feelings of survival, and you call it the euphoria of surviving, and you say that it dulls the senses and maybe informs your recollection of those things. You said there's no time limit on Collateral Damage, so these memories and these, I guess, the shock of those moments, they still have ripples in your life today?
They do, yes. There's more to that story that I couldn't write about. It's been over 55 years, and that day, that particular day, among many others, is still clear in my mind. That's why when I wrote the story, I mentioned the dappled sunlight, the things that I remember so clearly about 1, 2, or 3 hour period of one day 55 years ago.
Sheri, when you read Greater Love and Collateral Damage, were these things that Pat had not discussed with you or had discussed?
Never discussed with me. And after he wrote Collateral Damage, he was very upset that he'd written it because he didn't want me to know it. He kind of wanted to take it back. And Pat recently, actually in the last few months, said to me that the Vietnam War is like it's always playing on TV. And he can choose to watch it or not watch it, but it's always on. And that's a heavy price to pay for somebody who was 19 years old and made a decision to serve their country. He hadn't done anything that he wasn't commanded to do. Like, he didn't initiate something that he needed to regret. He might have participated in something he regrets, but he didn't create the scenario himself. He was just a participant, that had to follow orders.
The only thing I would say is from the time I reached my unit when I got to Vietnam, I was given an M79 grenade launcher. And it does exactly what it says. It fires a 40 millimeter grenade. The problem with carrying a grenade launcher is when you're assessing the damage after a firefight, it's clear, well, over time you learn to tell the difference between wounds from an M16 or even an M60 machine gun versus an M79, because that produces shrapnel. So that's a problem if you're the one carrying the M79.
Sheri, these recollections, I know you want your husband to open himself to you. It's got to be tough because on the one hand, you want to leave him in whatever bastion of silence and whatever protections Pat and all the veterans have built for themselves. At the same time, you're his wife and you want to know because you love him and you want to help. How do you balance those two? Leave him alone and discover so you can be part of it. How do you balance those two?
Well, I was only 26 when we got married, and everything I knew from Vietnam I had learned sitting on the floor in front of the news. I mean, when you go to school in Virginia, you learn Jamestown and Appomattox, and you spend so much time on that, you never get to the 20th century, much less Vietnam. So I had never seen a Vietnam War movie. Literally what I had seen was, Walter Cronkite or whatever, talking about it on the news as a child, peripherally. I was in kindergarten when Pat was in Vietnam. And so it was a very steep learning curve that I wasn't really prepared for. I have read a book since. It's called Vietnam Wise. Well, somebody should issue you that with your marriage certificate, because I didn't understand at the time the cost, the burden that he had. And so it was difficult. I kept asking the same questions for years. How did you get your 2 bronze stars? How did you get your Purple Heart? Questions like that. And he either said, I'll tell you sometime, or I was just doing what they told me to do. And those were the 2 answers. And I eventually understood that I wasn't going to know. And I had to be okay with that. And it was, your spouse, you keep thinking you're going to, his answers led me to believe I would find out someday. And, after about 10 or 12 years, I realized that is the answer. I'm done now asking that question. I don't ask that question any longer.
That's a great segue into our next 2 stories, written by Sheri Clark, The Things We Carry and The Real Thing, read by Melissa Price.
I always say that marriage is like erosion. You wear each other down, but slowly, gently. Passing years soften the jagged cliffs of differences, rounding them down to more compatible rolling hills, making it easier to navigate. But in the beginning, after saying, I do, it is mercifully impossible to see too far down the road. Every individual has a unique set of mismatched baggage. Worn train cases carry treasured, oft-thumbed memories. Tote bags are stuffed with skills, accomplishments, and college degrees. And smaller, darker duffels hide half-remembered hurts, grievances, and disappointments. In combining lives and emotional luggage, eventually the spouse is allowed into the more secret compartments. Like old postcards and souvenir maps, these private memories point the way, revealing some of the where and when, and, to the discerning and loving eye, a bit of the why of who you are. We had not been married long, a 20-something mother of 1 and a Vietnam veteran, when I was startled by a few single-sentence epiphany-producing comments about firefights and walking point. I was young and believed always what had been posted on classroom walls. Knowledge is power. I had not yet learned the corollary, contentment requires acceptance. So I forged ahead, asking questions. What happened when you were wounded, and how did you earn your bronze stars? It pains me now to admit that it took years to realize I could never know. He met each inquiry with a roulette of 3 responses. I just did what I was supposed to. The similar, I was just following orders. And the one that kept me asking for years, I'll tell you someday. Eventually, I came to understand that someday would never arrive. By that time, however, I had noticed baggage that traveled with us but was never opened. Heavy cases, locked and tightly secured, bearing seals from faraway places in Southeast Asia. Most of the time, these dark trunks went largely undisturbed and unnoticed. But occasionally, suddenly, unexpected swerves and abrupt turns in our journey caused them to break free from their taut fastenings, the weight of them thumping and knocking into the more fragile fixtures of our marriage. Realizing, somewhat belatedly, that as a veteran's wife I was both ill-equipped and uninformed, I launched my secret startup career as an amateur archaeologist and archivist, collecting and categorizing shards of information. I am the curator and only visitor of a mental museum of the Vietnam War. Like most museums, only a fraction of the inventory is available for display, and some topics are more comprehensively covered than others. Flora and fauna, less fraught, is one of the more complete, including information on the danger of elephant grass, the prevalence of leeches in bodies of water, and the alarming and aggressive meanness of water buffalo, which paradoxically prove wondrously docile under the direction of the smallest of Vietnamese children. Military lingo is a collection that casts no shadows, with first-hand information supplied matter-of-factly to questions. This category is subdivided into several sections. Vehicles include Hueys, Chinooks, Deuce-and-a-halfs, armored personnel carriers, C-130 cargo planes. Weapons represented: M14 and M16 rifles, M79 grenade launchers, Claymore mines. Military jargon consists of basic terms: MOS, AIT, and the very important never-to-be-lost form, DD-214. A subheading in this category includes cadence songs and sayings not repeatable, as well as some funny, frightening sayings such as never shoot at a tank and never show up late for an ambush. Other areas of investigation are skimpy or completely devoid of information. The box labeled Combat contains nothing except a couple of comments concerning cokes and a firefight and the fact that no 19-year-old should have to choose someone else to walk point. No other first-hand accounts have ever been made available for this collection. However, this topic has been supplemented by information gleaned from documentaries, as well as the films Platoon, Hamburger Hill, Full Metal Jacket, and We Were Soldiers Once. In my former non-veteran's wife life, I protected myself from war movies. Too intense, too upsetting. It's been a long time since I was that girl. I cannot justify that careless, ignorant innocence I previously cultivated. Only the craven crouch, eyes averted from the screen while ensconced safely on a suburban sofa. I now know that my concept of patriotism was inadequate. I came to understand that fluttering flags and hands put over our hearts to honor our country's warriors, the survivors, and the fallen is merely entry-level love of country. Whatever I may add, this collection will never be complete. But all I have accumulated informs my understanding, provides a dim illumination, and often, though sadly not always, provides a measure of patience. Sometimes I feel those heavy, unopened footlockers shift and bump as we visit the VA hospital. We pass the revolving doors, rarely used, too difficult for most, which have come to symbolize for me the constancy and cost of our country's ongoing wars. We enter the doors that open wide, revealing the motto, "The price of freedom is visible here." Yes, I walk among heroes, some assisted by sons and daughters, but most accompanied by spouses. Measured steps match those with walkers. Purposeful strides push wheelchairs. I am amidst a roll call of role models. Wives, only a few husbands yet, who strive to know and accept what they cannot possibly understand. Hurts visible, also often invisible. We all help carry those sealed and locked cases. I know now they come with us always, all the way to where they will be relinquished at last, at Arlington.
That was Sheri Clark's The Things We Carry. Finally, let's hear Sheri's The Real Thing, also read by Melissa Price. Then we'll return to our conversation with Pat and Sheri Clark.
Sometimes, after a firefight. My husband said, almost casually, my suburban, sheltered, oh-so-civilian psyche stopped, only for a heartbeat, then raced about in all directions, pinging against possibilities. Without fanfare, my calm, reserved husband continued the sentence, never realizing that his young wife had been dangling, wily coyote-like, over a cliff. Sometimes, after a firefight, a mama-san would appear selling cokes. In trying to process this preposterous-sounding scenario, I latched onto the lone familiar item. A Coke? Really, a Coke? Well, so, did you buy it? I continued as if this were a normal dialogue, one that traded trivialities, the conventional conversational give and take. Except that what he had given, I was unable to take in. After a firefight. They told us not to drink them, said they might be booby-trapped, but we always did. I clung to the one identifiable feature, like a shibboleth which would unlock the indecipherable. Well, were the Cokes cold? Where did they come from? I was beyond the looking glass. There have been many other circumstances, quick moments of recognition, slow times of tears and tension, and long, idle hours in VA waiting rooms, many ways in which the Vietnam War has marked our marriage. Looking over the decades, I realize that not with "I do," but with those words, sometimes after a firefight, did I become a veteran's wife.
Pat Clark, when we listened to your two stories, I started with Sheri. So this time I'm going to return the favor and start with you on her two spectacular pieces. What is it like being the museum that Sheri curates? How does that feel?
There's a combination of pride and remorse. Pride in the obvious ability she has to voice how she feels. The remorse is that I've laid this terrible burden on her.
Why terrible?
It's enough that I deal with what I remember, but the last thing that I want to do is make life harder for her.
I'm going to give you, Sheri, the chance to say that I don't think you're going to say he has made it harder. It feels, listening to that story and knowing you, you're proud of this. You're doing your patriotic duty by loving and supporting this good man and this soldier. Yeah.
I think it's my privilege, really. He's so humble and so compassionate, and he's given so much as a veteran and as a public school teacher that he has just given and given.
One of my favorite lines in The Things We Carry is, "Only the craven crouch." What are you saying to us with that line?
I think so many people want to put a sticker on their car to support veterans or stand proudly at the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem, but they don't want to do the hard work. They don't want to see the wounded. They don't want to see us offload the coffins at military funerals. They want to hide from that. They want to look at the flag, and I think that that's craven. Now, as from my vantage point that I have now, I was craven. I didn't have to watch war movies. Why would I subject myself to that? Other people sent their children and their spouses and their siblings off to do that, but I didn't have to subject myself to that.
It is clear that spouses serve to, good spouses say and feel exactly what you're saying and feeling about servicemen and women, and in this instance, of course, the love of your life, Pat Clark. Pat, the real thing is about the day whatever dam or walls you've built didn't come down, but there was a leak. It cracked. And you said, after a firefight, and I got to ask, what did she wear you down? Did she erode you, just like it says in the story? What made you speak that day?
She has quite an ability to wear me down, but that's not what happened. I think it was a feeble attempt to be humorous. And I didn't, it's like letting slip something that you can't undo once you've done it.
But Sheri, you used the phrase that the Vietnam War had marked your marriage. There's no way you're alone in that, right?
I think it's made me more aware of the cost and sometimes the futility of our foreign policy. But I think that it's made me reassess what service is, whether it's service to your country, obviously, as veterans, or service to the greater good, service to humanity, to the world, and I think that it's can be costly, and I think that it's really difficult to see someone you really love who has a weight on them always, and you forget it sometimes, but not for very long. The older you get, you realize that this is not something that's escapable, and they now use the term moral injury. And Pat is a very moral, ethical, compassionate person, and it hasn't been something he's worn lightly.
Pat, all these stories that we've listened to today and our discussion is essentially about memory. Yeah, we're not so much talking about the conduct of the war, but your stories are about the aftermath. As a good man, a moral man sent off to war, where do those memories play with you now? I mean, I know you said earlier that the Vietnam War is like a TV show. It's always on. You can watch it or not. You good with it?
I don't know that I'm good with it. It's not easy to think back about the cost of the war. I haven't been to the wall in a number of years, but a trip there tells you this terrible cost. And then that's balanced by what did we accomplish? So am I proud of my service? In some ways. I enlisted in the Army, as did most Vietnam veterans. We weren't all a bunch of loser draftees, the way some people like to express it, but it came at a terrible cost. I value what I learned in the Army. I value what I was able to do. But on a scale, is it worth it? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, that's a question I'll carry to the end.
I want to thank you both for coming in today. Two marvelous and dear people, a veteran and a veteran's wife. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
The Mighty Pen Project is a free writing program for military veterans and their families, offered by the Virginia War Memorial Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to learn more about the Mighty Pen or just send us your thoughts, email us at mpodcast@vawarmemorial.org or use the link in the podcast description. If you're a veteran or family member of a serviceman or woman listening to this podcast anywhere in America, and you want to learn how to best tell your own powerful stories, you can sign up for one of our Mighty Pen writing workshops on Zoom. If you want to read today's pieces, and many more, use the link to go to the Mighty Pen archive. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it. Music for this episode was provided by Jackson Albrecht. Lastly, if you'd like to support the Mighty Pen's efforts to record and preserve these stories of service, adventure, and sacrifice, follow the charitable donation link in the podcast description. I'm David L. Robbins, and I want to thank you for listening to the Mighty Pen Podcast. It's an honor.